Okay.
All right.
I see we've got about 80 participants here. Thank you all very much for joining us. We're waiting on Joe Kent, who has some technical difficulties at the moment. Hopefully, should be hopping on any minute now. I see actually I've got an email from him. So this should go about an hour. We'll try to extend it once Joe gets on. And I am replying to him right now. And CCing our producer who is on the line so he can assist. And for the last 10 minutes, we will take questions. But while we have you all here, we're going to try and get started. And as you have questions, you can enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom. But the subject of our conversation tonight is Israel's war in America first. And that is, I think, a very clear and pointed articulation of the question we're trying to ask, which is, what is America's role in this war? And what is America's national interest in this war? And that question is complicated by the fact that America seems to structurally be straddling both sides of this war. And anyone who's been following the news, anyone who's been reading Tablet, knows that Hamas is a group that is sponsored and backed by Iran, and that Hamas functions within a larger terror network, including groups like Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, lesser known groups in Iraq that the US has also had entanglements with, like Katab Hezbollah, Asad al-Haq. And the US, through its policy of détente and rapprochement with Iran, is funneling money into a system that is going to fund groups like not only Hezbollah, but also Hamas. So while the US is a stalwart ally of Israel's, it is functionally supporting Israel's, or has, at least in the past, functionally promoted Israel's enemy in this war, and is constraining Israel. And you can see that coming out now in the statements being made. There are a lot of mixed messages. There seems to be a kind of flood the zone approach to messaging right now from the White House, but statements about Israel being warned to back off Hezbollah, Israel being pressured to constrain its strategic and operational goals in this war. So with all that being said, Lee, how do you see America's role in this war so far, and where do you see the national interest lying?
Just 1 second. I'm just responding to Joe here.
Sure.
To see if we can get him in, because he's in, but he's not on the dedicated panelist account yet. Well, we Joe here. You and I wanted Joe here because Joe said some very important things on social media, and it was really interesting and really important. And you and Joe, of course, are veterans of the global war on terror. So I think that you guys, I'm keen to hear what you have to say, both your experiences and your perspective. I just wanted to start off by saying I think it's very, very important going forward, having this conversation, not just the three of us, but in general. I think it's important to get rid of some of the clutter. And by clutter, I mean there's a lot of concern on the right, and you hear it from leading opinion makers. You see it on social media. We're hearing it all around. People are concerned the United States might get dragged into a wider regional conflict with Iran. And of course, the Biden administration is messaging on this too. And I want to say clutter, that's not true, right? None of this is true. The Biden administration, like the Obama administration, wants to legalize Iran's nuclear weapons program. Between Barack Obama, people are talking a lot about the $16 billion that the Biden administration has made available in the last several months to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Well, but it's not just that $16 billion, right? Dating back to 2014, when the Obama administration first began bribing the Iranians to sit down and negotiate over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the U.S., the Obama administration, the Biden administration has gifted outright Iran tens of billions of dollars and made available hundreds of billions of dollars. This signals not a potential belligerent, right, but a prospective partner. That's what's going on here. So when this is one thing to get rid of immediately. Now you can make the case like, well, but I don't know, war, things get crazy, and the Biden administration wind up getting dragged into the middle of war. I mean, I'll hear that case, but let's just start with the fact that one of the concerns that people are expressing is not true. So let's be very clear about what the actual layout is here. The aircraft carrier group now in the Eastern Mediterranean is not there in support of Israel. It's there to deter Israel, right? Should Israel consider preemptively striking against Hamas's sister organization?
Seem to have lost Lee for a second here, so I'll jump in. And
I just thought it was
until he
important to lead
comes-
with that because we're hearing a lot of different stuff. People are concerned about.
Go ahead, Lee. I didn't mean to step on you. Oh, here we go. Joe, can you hear me? Okay, well, I have a visual on Joe.
All right, there we go. Hi, Joe.
Joe, can you hear me?
Hey guys, sorry about that.
Not a problem. Hey, it's great to have you. And I think we've got the preamble out of the way. So, Joe, if you don't mind, maybe we'll extend this for another 10 minutes so we can get a full hour in, and we'll leave that last 10 minutes still for Q&A. So Lee and I were just talking about sort of the strategic framework here, but I will say that for anybody who doesn't know, I mean, I think the great Lee Smith, tablet columnist, author of The Strong Horse, a book very much about politics and conflict in the Middle East, needs no introduction to our viewers. But anybody who doesn't know Joe Kent should. I think, Joe, you were in Ranger Battalion before Special Forces, right? Okay, so a Ranger and a Special Forces veteran, and also ran for Congress in Washington. And I was introduced to Joe originally in 2021. Joe wrote a Twitter thread that I thought maybe this is, speaks to the moment we're in, but I thought this tweet thread that Joe wrote about essentially the pivot in U.S. policy in Afghanistan was smarter than any foreign policy analysis I had read in any glossy magazine or really any newspaper on Afghanistan. It was the smartest thing I had read. I wrote a piece about it in the Scroll, the daily newsletter that I edit for Tablet, called The Lebanonization of Afghanistan. And essentially what Joe is describing there was a policy whereby the U.S. would pivot in Afghanistan from having fought the Taliban to then backing the Taliban on the grounds that we would need the Taliban as our allies to now confront ISIS-K, the infamous ISIS-K. And I don't want to ramble on too long, but it's immediately relevant here because the precedent Joe pointed to there was our policy in Iraq. I served as a U.S. Army officer in Iraq in 2006, 2007 during the surge. So I was very familiar with what he was talking about, which was that the same groups, the same Iranian-backed Shia militia groups that had attacked and killed U.S. soldiers, including two of my soldiers in my platoon, one of whom I personally helped medevac out of country after he was hit by an EFP, an explosively formed projectile, which were the deadliest form of IED that Iran had engineered. Those same groups responsible for those attacks were now in the ISIS, the counter-ISIS U.S. operation became U.S. allies in Iraq. And so it was this pivot, this new form of U.S. diplomacy in which groups that had been killing American soldiers became our allies in this new, grand Iran alliance that couldn't quite be spoken of out loud. Joe wrote something on this. I thought it was really brilliant, and that was why I wanted to have him on. So, Joe, with all of that being said, Lee just laid out the case that there are people on the right in particular who are worried about anyone drawing attention to Iran's role in this, attempting to draw the U.S. into direct military conflict, either in the Levant with Hezbollah, perhaps, or even in a direct confrontation with Iran. I think I know certainly the last thing I want, both as a Army veteran, American citizen, and as somebody who now lives in Israel, is for America to get directly involved in this war. I think that would be a disaster. But how do you answer that when you see people worrying that talk about Iran is an effort to draw the U.S. in? How do you respond to that?
Unfortunately, Washington, D.C. is just full of so many really unserious people when it comes to foreign policy that we get told these two binary things. You get Lindsey Graham on one side, who's like, you know what, we need to start bombing Iran like yesterday. And then you've got all of the Obama, Biden national security apparatus who refuse to address Iran unless they're giving them billions of dollars and basically putting us in a position where Iran has maximum leverage against us. The only person I saw thread this needle or even come close to having a coherent and rational strategy was President Trump. I mean, he understood that we needed to take out key Iranian leaders so they couldn't push us around, while he killed Qasem Soleimani, Abu Mahdi Mohandas. But then at the same time, he resisted the John Bolton, Lindsey Graham wing, who said that, hey, now we need to continue to do these regime change wars and start bombing Iran because, well, Iran is just bad. So I think right now we've really got to take a rational and sober approach to what's happening. And the first part of that, I think, is really just defining what the U.S. national security interest is in the region. And really, if the way that you look at how Biden set the table, the fact that we are now back to being dependent on Middle Eastern oil, to me, that's one of the original sins. What Trump got right was that he made us energy independent and a net exporter of energy. So we didn't need anything from OPEC. And also, we are taking away from their bottom line. So Trump or whoever the US president was going to be could walk into a situation in the Middle East and not owe any of them anything. And that's a position I think we need to come from. And it also takes away a lot of the strategic value of like the Straits of Hormuz. Straits of Hormuz is incredibly strategic, especially for Iran. It's part of their backyard. And so they've always kind of got that ace in the hole where they can turn the Straits of Hormuz into a bloodbath. They'd eventually lose, but I don't think they're necessarily all that worried about that if all the cards were on the table and it was go time essentially for the Iranians. The same thing with us having all of our troops or so many troops in the region that are within striking distance of Iranian proxies. We basically handed the government of Iraq to the Iranians. They use it for their own fiscal gain, but also we've got this massive embassy, the biggest embassy in the entire world, sitting there in Baghdad as a very fat target for the Iranians to strike at the time of their choosing, whenever it's strategically the most beneficial to them. They have very well-trained proxies there. Same thing to a certain extent in Syria. We've got troops in Syria caught between the Assad regime, Iran, Russia, the Turks who are aligned with the Qataris. It's an absolute mess. We only stand to lose in this position. So we've really set the table where we actually have very little, if any, leverage. And so then we're left with this binary choice of like, well, then how do we support Israel? I don't know. Quickly, let's send multiple aircraft carriers and naval battle groups over there off the coast of the Mediterranean, and we're back into this very black and white world, as opposed to just having an assessment of what our leverage points are and how that can best assist our allies, in particular Israel, at a time like this.
Yeah, Joe, and I saw you make a point that one of the obvious leverage points, since we have CENTCOM co-located with Hamas leadership at this point, is funding for Qatar, right? And there are economic leverage points, it seems, sort of distributed across the operating environment here. Obviously, you've got the billions of dollars flowing to Iran. That would be a key leverage point. Then you've got Qatar, but you've also got Egypt, which is now assumed an increasingly central role in all of this. Egypt is a primary beneficiary of U.S. funding and subsidies. So the financial leverage seems clear. The other thing I would say is that a point of leverage for the U.S. is not to message openly that we are going to constrain Israel from achieving significant strategic objectives. Now, I have to say, frankly, what I'm seeing is that the Israelis are, in some ways, doing something that wise statecraft typically tells you never to do, which is they are talking in very big terms about how much they're going to accomplish and about changing the whole nature of Gaza. And usually you want to speak softly and carry a big stick is the rule of thumb. But granted that that's happening, the U.S. messaging seems to be another place where maybe a little bit more of a tactical pause in terms of what we're putting out might be an advantage. What do you think about that, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. But I mean, right now, the U.S. has so little credibility in the region. I mean, Anthony Blinken just got back from this tour where he went and saw a lot of our, so-called regional allies. I know he took a stop in Qatar, and I don't know if he didn't sound like publicly he addressed the fact that Ismail Haniyeh and the Hamas leadership was sitting right down the street from him. And then he goes to Egypt and talks to them. And after our performance in Afghanistan, the fact that we are funding the Iraqi government to the tune of billions of dollars, Iran is using the Iraqi government to circumvent sanctions to get another 10 billion that we know of from oil concessions. We haven't even addressed the original 6 billion that people keep talking about that apparently is still frozen in Qatar. None of that was discussed. So I don't see how Blinken has any credibility going around the region. But yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a very good point. We should be utilizing all of our leverage, but it's really hard for us to say that we are 100% supporting Israel in any kind of a quantifiable way other than the aid that we already give them. That aid's been on auto pay. That's bipartisan. No one's questioning that. But we go over there and we say, yes, we support Israel, but then if we won't address Iran, we won't address Qatar, we won't address Iraq, all these different countries that are Iran's using to circumvent sanctions, that it's using to train, arm, and equip its proxies. And I think the issue there, the 100-pound gorilla or the 800-pound gorilla in the room with that one is just like, well, then how did Iran get all that power? And a lot of this goes back to all the blunders that we've made over the years that we quite frankly don't want to admit because it's a bipartisan disaster by multiple parties. So I think that's the original sin. That's why I think one of the most valuable things we could be doing right now is using all of our economic leverage to go after Qatar, Iraq, and the resources that Iran has, and then just give Israel the space they need to take care of literally their backyard, to take care of Gaza, not dictate to them how they go about avenging the death of over 1,000 of their own civilians.
Lee, when you evaluate the landscape here in terms of U.S. credibility in the region, first of all, how do you assess it at this point, and what could the U.S. do to restore credibility, not only for leverage in this conflict, so that going forward the U.S. Negotiating position and strategic position in the region is stronger?
Well, I agree with Joe that U.S. credibility is shot in the region. I mean, this would probably, and Joe mentioned Donald Trump before. I think this probably winds up, and I don't want to get into this too much, but I think it probably comes back to a discussion about what Donald Trump did as president. A lot of Donald Trump fans rightly praise him for unlike many of his predecessors, getting the United States involved in another adventure abroad. But that's not, from my perspective, what made him a great foreign policy president. So I think he was a superb foreign policy president. It's that he had his eyes focused on what was the national interest, right? He recognized how important alliances were, right? And also Donald Trump was not afraid to use force, right? I mean, Joe mentioned before Qasem Soleimani, and you remember how everyone from Joe Biden to all of the liberal press melted down after he killed this guy who had a lot of American blood on his hands, as well as blood of Israelis and American allies throughout the region. People were losing their minds. I think that is one of the reasons why Donald Trump was able to keep the United States out of additional conflicts, because people were afraid because Donald Trump had shown he was willing to use force to protect Americans, to advance the American interest. And there's something else about Donald Trump temperamentally as well, right? No one really knows which way he's going to go. Right. This was something else that was very important. We know the story now about how he wanted to kill Bashar al-Assad after he saw pictures of how Assad had killed Syrian kids. And it was then Defense Secretary James Mattis who stopped Trump from doing so. Whether he would have killed Assad or not, I think is another question. What I'm saying is I think that American adversaries and allies had a pretty good read on Donald Trump, on both his temperament and his willingness force. That's a very important thing, right? And we don't have that right now with the Biden administration. And Joe Biden, it's not that you can turn this around and get this back. And because there's something very important here, which I think is often which the last week we've basically been neglecting, and that Joe Biden has a very big hostage crisis on his hands. There are, I don't know the exact numbers now. I believe there's, the death toll keeps changing, but there are at least 27 Americans who've been killed in Israel. And this is so while it's Israel's war, Israel's territory, while these are Israeli areas, has a very big issue here. And this isn't something that Joe Biden or the Biden administration is pressing. And I don't expect them, I don't want them to be screaming like Lindsey Graham or Nikki Haley about how we're going to do this or we're going to do that. But I think at some point they're going to have to speak with the American people about this. What's going on? There are 27, probably more Americans who are dead right now. And there are another dozens more who have been kidnapped. So when we're talking about American credibility, it's unclear whether the Biden administration is even finding a way to discuss a very important thing that a lot of Americans are thinking about right now.
Yeah, I believe this is the largest American hostage crisis since the Iranian hostage crisis, and this seems to not be coming up at all in a lot of conversations about that. And I have to think that that's deliberate. There's something useful in framing this as purely America's war, or excuse me, purely Israel's war with America in this sort of big brother advisory role. But it doesn't look good for America's ability to protect its own interests in the region if there's no response to a massive hostage situation. By the way, just to say very quickly, I believe the last time there were this many the most recent significant hostage situation prior to this was the one in 2015, wasn't it? With the American soldiers taken by Iran. That was another recent incident. So. Yeah. So, Joe,
can I ask something?
Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Both of you guys, because just to get your sense of it, I'm actually writing about this later. But what is your sense of what? And again, this is partly a rhetorical framework to understand to describe what's going on. Given this situation, what would Donald Trump be doing, right? Or what would Donald Trump be planning to say? They killed 30 Americans. Donald Trump loves Americans. Donald Trump loves children, right? What would Donald Trump? How would he be thinking about this? And again, I'm just trying to get. I think this helps give a little context to how this particular White House is thinking about it. To also imagine how Trump would be thinking about it, because again, I think he was a great foreign policy president.
I
Joe,
think
you want
Trump
to take
would,
a stab at that?
Yeah, I think he wouldn't be beating around the bush. I think especially when you have Hamas leadership sitting in Qatar, I think Trump would go over there and I think he'd play hardball. I think he would say, you're going to hand those guys over to the Israelis, or bare minimum, you're at least going to expel them from Qatar. Or guess what? We are done economically doing business with you guys. I think he'd probably say the same thing to the government of Iraq. Trump was, I think, very proficient, yes, at using force, but also at using the tools of diplomacy and economics. Same thing he did with the immigration crisis. Yeah, he didn't get the border wall built the way that he wanted to, but he went to Mexico and said, I'm going to tariff everything to 50% and up if you don't stop these migrant caravans. And boom, wouldn't you know it, that seriously stopped the flow of illegal immigrants coming into our country. country. So I think he'd be using those main tools. And I don't think he would take lethal strikes against Iranian Quds Force operatives off the table. The target assassinations of Soleimani were very effective. He took a couple other swings after leaders of Kataib al-Hezbollah and some of the other groups, in particular in Iraq and Syria, where they're kind of in the hinterlands. I think that would be on the table as well, just to show the Iranians that we actually meant business.
Yeah, look, that's where I would start. There are Iranian assets distributed across the region, right? So everybody is looking at Gaza right now. Everybody's looking at Israel right now. But there are Iranian assets and facilitation nodes, for, key sort of logistical nodes, rat lines running through Syria. Iraq, the Iraqi government, which is now functionally aligned with Iran, is a government we built. That's our project. That was a U.S. project. Like I said, I was deployed to Iraq in 2006, 2007. I went back to Iraq in 2014 as a reporter. And all of the stories I wrote in 2014 were me scratching my head, asking, what does the U.S., what does President Obama believe that he is accomplishing by funding the Shia militia groups who both can't possibly integrate with the Sunni groups? Because at the time we were claiming that we were going to form a multi-ethnic, one Iraq national government. But I knew that couldn't possibly happen from my experiences in Iraq during my deployment. Just a very quick anecdote. I was on a FOB in Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's hometown, called FOB Ramagan. We were working with the people in Tikrit at the local police station. The whole deployment with the 101st Airborne, we were trying to set things up to turn over a police station to the Ministry of the Interior, right, which is the Baghdad-based national organization. Well, after a year spent trying to do that, at the last minute, there was a coup, essentially, because the Sunnis in Tikrit viewed the Shia-run MOI as a roving death squad, essentially, not without some justification. And so I knew when I went back in 2014 that these claims about integration couldn't possibly be true. And I bring that up because I didn't understand it when I was a reporter at the time. I was calling attention to it, but I thought this was strategic confusion. I thought this was strategic incoherence. What I couldn't understand at the time was, no, we were promoting these Shia militia groups as part of a broader strategy to empower Iran as part of this, Iranian nuclear deal, this grand detente with Iran that was the centerpiece of the Obama White House. It wasn't until I started reading guys like Lee and Mike Duran and Tony Badran that I understood that this wasn't an error. This was deliberate. I bring all of that up to say, I think that there are still a lot of people, tablet readers, maybe Americans, American Jews, who have a hard time, looking soberly at the legacy of Donald Trump compared to what's going on in the two bookend Democratic White Houses. But if you look at it soberly, in my opinion, you cannot possibly fail to see that the degree of stability, the degree of power projection that America achieved during the Trump years was an oasis of kind of American stability and power, surrounded by what was otherwise, a kind of sea of carnage and chaos, the Syrian civil war, what's going on now. So I think what Trump would have done is something that kept people off balance, hit Iran where it hurts without overcommitting to a long-term or deliberate involvement, hit Iran where it hurts, but sort of provide them with an out at the same time. That's my sense of what he would have done.
I think something else that's pretty key in this context, but also in the sense of what Trump would have done is I think he would have reminded, in particular, the Gulf Arabs, Saudi Arabia, that look, Iran is doing this right now. Iran is funding Hamas to attack Israel right now to break up the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords is the #1 threat to Iran because it basically unites Israel, it unites all the Gulf Arabs and says, hey, let's not worry about the Palestinian issue. Let's put that to the side. Let's focus on our common ground. Let's look at realpolitik. Iran is a threat to all of us. let's create this alliance. And Iran has this timing right now because they don't want Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords or anything like the Abraham Accords. So this is very tactical. They want to put the Palestinian issue back front and center so that no progress can be made in the Middle East until this issue is resolved. I frankly don't think this issue is ever going to be resolved. This was some of, I think, just the outsider genius of President Trump when he said, hey, what's been the issue of Middle Eastern peace? And everyone's just said Palestine, Palestine, Palestine. And Trump went around it and said, well, hey, what if we just forget about that? And we focus on what we actually have in common, which is a lot of things. And that led to this brief era of peace that we had. And unfortunately, the Biden administration is so deeply wedded to this concept that we're going to have some sort of a rapprochement with Iran, a country that's never, ever wanted any kind of rapprochement with us, that they're willing to sacrifice the peace that the Abraham Accords brought about. So it's really sad that Blinken and our State Department isn't reminding our partners of like, hey, don't take the bait. Let's not go back down this spiral of Arabs versus Israelis versus Americans. Let's focus on what we have in common, and that is peace and stability in the region. And the number one hindrance to peace and stability in the region, it's the Iranians.
Yeah, look, I think when we act with power and confidence in the region, we secure our peace at home, which is what we want, right? That's what we all want here, is not to be involved endlessly in arbitrating disputes in the Middle East or adjudicating who should lead what government in Iraq. That should not be America's role. America's role in the Middle East should be to, protect its vital national interests, support its allies, punish its enemies when necessary, and do all of that in the name of securing peace at home, which is finally the point of all of this. Lawrence of Arabia dream of democratizing the Middle East, and the Bush version for another dream of democratizing the Middle East, and the Obama version. It's to allow Americans to have peace in their own homeland. Just one quick thing along the lines of what Joe just said. Remember back to when Trump moved the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem? Do you remember all of the geniuses, all of the mandarins in DC predicted that there would be chaos, would erupt, the Arab street would revolt? None of that happened, right? None of that happened. What did Trump do? Trump showed that he supported his allies. He showed that he wouldn't be blackmailed by a kind of moribund, stale thinking that, is great if you want tenure at a think tank, but doesn't actually resolve anything, doesn't actually promote America's interests. And in doing that, what ended up happening was that we had more peace in the region, not less, exactly the opposite of what the experts predicted.
Hey, can I ask? On the spot. Well, first of all, is my reception, because I keep seeing things that my reception is trouble. Can you guys see me okay and hear me okay?
We can see you. You're glitching a bit, but we've got you. Okay.
Look, Joe was talking before about our domestic energy production, right? That's a big deal. And with our own domestic energy industry, when it's sailing along, our interests in the region are minimized, right? I mean, they still exist, but they're minimized. And remember what Trump said after the press and the Democratic Party used the Khashoggi murder to get him to break away from Saudi. Trump, again, this way, he's a great foreign policy president. He said, no, because the Saudis help keep the price of oil low, and that's good for America. And I just came back from Riyadh, my first trip as president, and they're going to invest a whole bunch of money in the United States, and that's great for jobs. That's great for American jobs. So no, we're not going to break off from the Saudis. Suck it. So while the Saudis, the Emiratis are important for some reasons, the Israelis and the Egyptians are important for other reasons, but isn't our stake in the region much less important if we ramp up, if we restore our domestic energy industry to the way it was, to the way Donald Trump is pushing it, to Trump era energy production?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that makes it so that we don't need as much from the region, so they have less leverage over us. I also think it gives us, it kind of puts us in the driver's seat, because if we fully tapped in to the full capabilities of U.S. energy between what we have in the Northeast, Texas, and up in Alaska, I mean, then we could be in a position of, I think, a good deal of power where we are the ones that are actually controlling the price of oil. And that takes away money out of the pocket of basically all the bad actors in the world. I mean, you hear folks on the left with the Ukraine issue talking about, like, well, we got to stop Putin. Well, why didn't Putin attack Ukraine under Trump? Like, it's a complicated issue, but at the same time, when we flood the market with cheap U.S. energy, that takes away from Putin's bottom line. He didn't have as much money in the bank as he did once Biden killed off U.S. energy independence. So I think it's very important. It takes away some of the importance of the region. It doesn't make it as much of a tinderbox for us, and it lets us step back, I think, and take a leadership role. But then also it makes it so that we're just not as vulnerable. That's another reason why I'm against us having massive ground forces, whether it's at our embassy or whether it's in Syria, in places where proxies can actually reach us. Just look at what advantages your enemy has and then take them away.
You think the Baghdad embassy is bad? You should wait and see what the embassy is going to look like in Lebanon. We have a colleague at Tablet, Tony Bedran, working on it. I mean, it's a nightmare. But the message that it's basically sending is, yeah, this is our portal to the Iranians. I mean, it's just insane. It's like they're not listening to the American public. They're not looking at recent history. They're lunatics.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the point, right? It's sending that message. That's not an error. That's the message they're trying to send. And they're trying to send that message in large part, I think, because of energy interests. I mean, I don't think you can evaluate where all of this is coming from without looking at the LNG side of it, and the fact that there are enormous energy interests at stake and connected to U.S. foreign policy decisions that are presented in terms of national security, but seem to ignore Joe's point, which is that the most obvious strategic step to take to protect U.S. national security would be to promote strategic energy independence. And yet that has been undermined, demonized in ideological terms. And Joe, I would be curious what you think of this, but it seems to me that some of that has to represent financial conflicts of interest.
Most certainly. I mean, I do think that there is the lower information, but very vocal green side that says, like, hey, we need to get away from all carbon-based, anything, and we need to move to wind and solar and all this other nonsense. But I think the real movers and shakers within the Democrat Party, they know that none of those energy platforms are ready for prime time. So they know that we still need to have the ability to tap into some oil and natural gas. And so they have these horrible relationships overseas. But then also, like, look, the Chinese Communist Party are the ones that are producing the vast majority of the renewables and the lithium batteries and all those types of things. And you've got a commander in chief who's deeply compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. And you've got the CCP pumping in so much money into Wall Street, into the lobbyists, that, like, we have this, it's in our ruling class's best interest to make us not energy independent here, to make us dependent on either Middle Eastern oil or what the Chinese Communist Party is putting out in renewables. And that just, speaks, I think, to the rot of our ruling class in Washington, D.C. And it's another reason why America First, I just think, is so, demonized by the so-called adults in the room and the lobbyists and all the D.C. insiders.
Jake, I just want to add to what Joe was saying. I mean, the Chinese also have an enormous stake in Iranian energy as well. I mean, you don't have to be as cynical as I am to say. So here's how it went down. The first thing that Joe Biden did as president was to crash the U.S. domestic energy industry. And what does that make? I mean, it makes Russian energy and Iranian energy more and more valuable. Why? Why would they do that? Why would they do something like that? Because this was part of the purpose of the Iran deal, right? It was to open up all these markets for investors. I mean, it's absolutely nuts when you think about it. the point of impoverishing the American public, right, and making our energy more expensive is to help out the donor class, the left in this case, but also on the right, as well as international investments from Europe and Asia. It's absolutely insane. We're the lever they use to make Iranian energy more valuable by crushing our domestic energy industry and making it more expensive. It's mind-boggling. The corruption is just astonishing.
Yeah, Joe, where do you see the future for looking ahead for a second? Where do you see the future for U.S. policy in Iraq, for instance, in countries where we've had a long-term interest, where we've played a decisive role in shaping the government, where we have this enormous embassy, obviously representing continued interests? Is there a way for us to sort of get out of that cleanly while still protecting core American interests?
The crazy thing about how much money we spent in Iraq and how much we built that government, we shaped it, we funded it twice. The initial time after Saddam, and then that government basically collapsed under the weight of ISIS with a few exceptions. And so then we had to go back and we had to rebuild it. We had to refund it all over again. Despite all of that, we have very little control over the government of Iraq because the Iranians did such a great job with the long game, and we fell for it, starting with the Bush administration, because they got played for suckers in the lead up to the Iraq war. But then once things got chaotic, basically the Shia militia groups, controlled by Iran, basically became the easy button that would give a little bit of stability so we could make it seem like we were, turning the corner in Iraq. But despite all of that, we've got very little control. So I don't know if there is a clean way to exit from Iraq. I personally would say before we take any more casualties, before one more American gets harmed over there, I would pull us out unless the Iraqis were willing to make major concessions about pushing back against Iran. And I quite frankly don't think that they can, because Iran is so deeply embedded into the Iraqi government, the Iraqi economy. So right now, I think all we stand to do is lose with the way that our current relationship is in Iraq. Same thing to a certain extent with Syria. So it's a very, dangerous position that we're in right now, because if Iran doesn't get what they want, or if they think that we're moving in a more aggressive posture, that embassy in Baghdad is going to get lit up like a Christmas tree. And it's a very well defended embassy. It's been besieged, it's been rocketed, and we've been lucky so far. But it's in a bad location, and the enemy's only got to be lucky once, as we've seen multiple times over. The Israeli Gaza border is one of the most heavily secured borders, and we saw what happened there. So I personally think you need to be able to cut your losses at some point, and this is something that we haven't been able to do yet in the war on terror. These places keep sucking us back in. So I am a fan of just cutting our losses in places like Iraq.
Let me bring it back to Israel for a second. You've got this massive buildup of ground forces in the south of Israel. It seems that an invasion, full offensive into Gaza is imminent. It seemed imminent for days. It's possible it's been held up for operational reasons, also possible it's been held up based on political pressure from the US and other actors in terms of trying to sort of negotiate their interests and press Israel to set up a humanitarian corridor, et cetera. It's probably, I would wager some combination of all of that. In the kind of bigger picture of how does America support its ally Israel without getting drawn into the fighting or triggering a kind of escalatory cycle that gets out of control? I wrote an article with my colleague at Tablet a few months ago arguing that the U.S. should stop providing aid to Israel, that the form of aid that is being provided is not in Israel's interest or in the U.S.'s interest long-term, because I don't think it's long-term in the U.S. interest to be managing client states throughout the world. But the effect of the aid provided to Israel, and the reason why the aid, the largest aid package ever, was approved under President Obama at the same time that he was concluding the Iran deal, was to put a kind of straitjacket on Israel, in my opinion, and to constrain its options, to force it into a U.S. framework in the region that has included, as our colleague at Tablet, Tony Badran, has documented very extensively, the buildup of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the idea of integrating all of these different actors in the region. So, in other words, what I'm getting at is that I think the best thing that the U.S. could do for Israel right now would be to back off, stop trying to manage outcomes in terms of protecting this sort of web of financial and defense industry interests throughout the region, and allow Israel to go after its own vital interests the same way, in the context of American vital interests, we would want the U.S. to go after its core interests. And the reason why I say that finally is because in curtailing what the Israelis can do, and I don't mean that the U.S. can't offer any kind of aid or push for some kind of humanitarian relief or something like that. Maybe there's a role, but in always cutting off these conflicts, in sort of pressuring Israel into only responding to Hamas rockets with a little bit of a counterattack, but leaving the basic Hamas infrastructure in place, which is presented as the kind of more humane, more acceptable to international opinion option. What you end up doing is costing more lives by prolonging this conflict, preventing it from ever being resolved, putting in these sort of artificial life support systems because Israel is forced to deal with an intolerable threat on its border. And the Hamas leadership is given the impression that it can act with a degree of impunity is the right word, given their current presence in Qatar. So that would be how I would see an improvement in this relationship, and I would see that as benefiting both parties. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I would agree that we need to stay out of dictating tactical terms to the Israelis. I mean, number one, it's their backyard. It was by and large Israeli citizens who were murdered in cold blood by Hamas terrorists. So I don't think we have any business saying like, yeah, use this weapon system, not that weapon system, trying to referee that tactical fight. But again, I mean, I really think that we should be focusing on what our vital national security interests are. And I think by and large, those align with Israel's, and stop this appeasement of Iran. Like all these guys that are trying to revise the Iran deal, and they're just hoping that sucker will work. I hope that they realize that that idea is as dumb as George Bush's, we're going to go and topple regimes and we'll be greeted as liberators nonsense. Like, let's get pragmatic. Let's go after the Hamas leadership in Qatar. Let's go after all the different Iranian assets. These are things that we could do from the peripheries, and then really remind our allies in the Gulf that, look, don't take the bait. Iran is trying to break up the Abraham Accords because the Abraham Accords is the biggest threat to Iran. Let's preserve and strengthen the Abraham Accords. Let's not get sucked into Israel versus the Palestinians versus Hamas and all that nonsense. Let's let that situation sort itself out, and let's stay above the fray. And if all these nations in the region look out for their vital national security interests, actually we'll be in a much better position, and we'll be able to isolate Iran.
Lee, how do you see the future of the Abraham Accords and the broader?
Well, it just struck me. It just struck me what Joe was saying. I mean, in a sense, you can see that the Abraham Accords were meant to outlast, were meant to survive democratic presidents, right? Because the Abraham Accords, Trump built them in order to build an anti-Iran, an anti-Iran deal order of the region that Barack Obama built and that Joe Biden has tried to, well, Joe Biden is rebuilding right now. And Trump is saying, no, let's keep the Palestinians out of it. Let's keep the Iranians out of it. And you guys just look at each other and work some things out. So while it was brokered by the United States, it was created for it to survive meddling of democratic administrations, right? So I think the Abraham Accords are really important. And Jake, I'm glad you talked about the piece that you did with Liel, because I think that what we might be seeing here is, if there is U.S. interference, it's quite possible that Israeli decision makers are going to are going to have to do some pretty big thinking about this, because this wasn't just a barrage of rocket, right? This was something else. This was of a different scope and different character. So I'm actually I think it's actually possible. I won't say whether I'm hopeful or not, but I think it's possible that over the course of the next few months or maybe years, there is going to be a different. The Israelis are probably going to have to come around to your way of thinking, that it's better for them not to be tied to the U.S. through aid. And I think as you said, I think it's better for the United States as well, to the extent that the United States is able to minimize its position in the Middle East. The Israelis and the Arabs, the Gulf states, should look at each other, and the Israelis in Morocco, right? And they should work together and find different things to do. And if they manage to do something for the Palestinians, God bless them, that's great. But insofar as the United States can come back and say, we have our energy industry, we have allies there, we have people that we revere and care about, but it's not the way it was in the 70s. It's certainly not the way it was in the 2000s or 2010s. It's very different. So the region is going to have to exist on its own. And again, I think it's going to depend on what the Netanyahu government, how they respond, because we know the Biden administration is going to try to deter the Israelis the way that the Bush administration deterred the Israelis during the Second Lebanon War, right? And I can predict how this is going to go, right? Once the Israelis get to move, Biden's going to be there Wednesday, so they're not going to be able to do anything before Wednesday, right? Once they are able to move, because we can tell from the language they're using, which is what it's about proportionality, it's about international law. Just as Hezbollah did in 2006, Hamas will stage a war crime. The Biden administration, along with its international partners, will step in and say, no, you've done what you could do, and that's enough. You have 48 hours left, and that's it. So we'll see what happens at that point. If the government of Israel says, no, we're not done yet, and we can't stop, because if we don't actively deter, a lot of people are using words like revenge and retaliation. Okay, that's fine, but it's deterrence, right? I mean, I believe the death toll now is up to 1,800 or something like that. I mean, so something serious has to be done, and it will depend again a lot on how the Netanyahu government will respond. What the Biden administration is not just signaling, but is saying outright. And maybe it'll break. Maybe we'll come out of this with a different order of the region, and the United States will have no choice to pull back. I don't know if that means that a Democratic president back on, but I think we'll have to be pulling back. I hope.
Yeah, you and me both. So look, I think we've got about 10 minutes left here. If either of you have something you want to jump in with, be my guest. Otherwise, let me take a few questions here. We had one at the beginning from Jonathan Warman, who's asking us to please discuss UN Resolution 2334, Obama's last act, policy designed to make the state of Israel indefensible. So I can't address that because I don't know exactly what that UN resolution is. So
I can address it quickly. I mean, yeah, it was basically Obama's last act as president. And Biden played a part in it. And check this out. What Joe Biden did, which our pal Vlad Davidson reported at Tablet, was Biden strong-armed none other than the Ukrainians, right, to get their vote at the UN to get through 2334. What it did was, it's shocking. I don't know if it was meant to make. What it said was that even some of the holy sites in Jerusalem were occupied territory.
Right.
So, the way I see it is that it's a very important sign of how the Obama administration and how the progressive, how the ascendant faction of the Democratic Party looks at Israel. So all these things are very important to keep in mind right now as Joe Biden goes to Jerusalem and speaks with the Netanyahu government.
Yeah. Well, we got a question here. Does the Israeli leadership understand the troubling nature of the Biden administration's Mideast policy? I think all we can say is stay tuned. I think there is no doubt that there are people within the Israeli government who are aware of this. I would include Netanyahu, but look, frankly, Netanyahu's gone along with a lot of this. He's fought back at certain points, but he's also, procured aid. He's also in previous conflicts with Gaza. He's sort of played by the set of rules provided, the framework and timeline provided by the quote unquote international community. So it's not as if the political divisions in Israel match perfectly with who is willing to break with the precedent here. I think, as Lee points out, the nature of this attack, the savagery of it, the fact that the death toll was so high, the fact that it was an attack that the Israeli public will not live without knowing that the security situation has been changed dramatically enough that they have attained a measure of additional security and peace. I don't think revenge is the point. Revenge is a personal motivation. The point of a war, if it's going to be successful, is to attain peace in the homeland. So something drastic needs to change to accomplish that. Who within the Israeli government is willing to do that? I think we simply don't know right now, and we'll have to see how they respond.
I think some of the Israelis are very aware of as well is that it's an election year coming up here. We're less than a year away from a presidential. And so I think that gives a good deal of leverage to the Israelis and honestly to a lot of the actors in the region, because Biden really can't afford another foreign policy debacle. So if you want a certain behavior from the administration and you can convince them that, hey, this is going to make you look weak unless you do X, Y, and Z, it gives them a lot of leverage. And that's just another danger, I think, of having a president who's not just, compromised by so many different people, but also he's very in the hole on foreign policy. And so I could see an over reaction and us getting involved in this by, just sheer blundering. Hezbollah takes an action. We strike Hezbollah. Next thing you know, you got Hezbollah shooting at, U.S. Vessels off the Mediterranean coast. And now we're in a hot war all of a sudden. All because Biden didn't want to look weak. And so I think we're very dangerous times we're in right now, especially in an election year.
That's a good question here. Can anyone comment on Turkey's role?
Well, the Turks and the Qataris are pretty tight. And they've been attempting, I think, to become bigger players in the region. There's the whole issue with the Qatar-Turkey pipeline that was supposed to go through Syria. A lot of our actions inside Syria were to block that. And then Turkey's also a NATO member. So the Turks can be puppet masters to a certain extent. They were most certainly puppet masters in the conflict in Syria. They've been on both sides of that, pro-Assad, against Assad. And so I think the Turks are enjoying their position where they can sit back and they can play essentially both sides. They can be a NATO partner on one side, and then they can also deal with some of the worst Islamists in Qatar and other places on the other hand.
Yeah, I think this is a good last question here, and it tees up something for Lee and Joe. I'd love for you to address this too. And the question is, who do you think the key decision makers behind the U.S.'s current foreign policy are? It seems hard to imagine that it's Biden. And I would just direct anybody who has not yet read it to, I believe it's Lee's last two pieces for Tablet. One is on the relevance of the Iran deal and what's going on now. And the one right before that is on an individual by the name of Robert Malley, who I'll let Lee talk more about, but I think had certainly a pretty decisive role in policy in the region.
I'll just say very quickly. I mean, I can sound like a paranoid conspiracy theorist and just say, yeah, of course it's Barack Obama and Joe Biden's just an avatar, which I believe, but it also makes me sound like a nut. So I'll just leave it at this. The fact that Joe Biden is keen to restore the Iran deal And he has all of these different Obama figures working on Iran, like Malley, even though Malley is now out of the administration, tells you, right? The course has been set, right? The course was set during the Obama years. This is what the ascendant faction, the Democratic Party, wants. So we can either say that Obama is doing, is controlling it from day to day, which I really believe, or it's just like, no, this is the way they're going. And that course was set with the Iran deal. So that's how I see it. That's what it is. This is Barack Obama's vision for the Middle East, and it's Barack Obama's vision for America as well.
I mean, I would agree with that for sure. When you're looking at who's driving the ship strategically, you've got the old Middle East hands that are deeply invested in the Iran program. Everyone Lee mentioned. I mean, Sullivan and Blinken, the top two guys, they were Iran deal guys. They worked on the Biden campaign, the Obama administration. You see the same thing to a certain extent too with Ukraine, with Samantha Power, Victoria Nuland. It's just all the Obama retreads that are in there, either directly taking guidance from Obama, or that's the overall strategic vision. But what I also think is dangerous is I like to say that the Biden administration like operates at like the confluence of like incompetence, malice, and hubris. And so I think at any given time, like they can kind of lose their minds and make some really bad decisions, like we saw in the withdrawal out of Afghanistan. Like I don't know what moron thought it would be a great idea to put the State Department in charge of the actual tactical plan to get people out. I don't think that was part of any kind of like 3D chess of them trying to screw it up. I think they just literally put incompetent people in charge of that. And that's why this is just so dangerous when you have so many moving pieces and our interests are so, murky and nebulous at times that like a rocket goes and hits an American, or we decide for whatever reason we're going to take a defensive strike against Hezbollah or something to that effect. And the next thing you know, now we're in a position where America can't back down because it's an election year. So, I mean, honestly, I just think we're in probably one of the more dangerous times that we've been in quite some time. So this is going to be interesting and also a little bit scary to see how things shake out.
Yeah, look, just the final word I would offer here is that, as somebody who fought in two wars in the Middle East for America that led nowhere, as far as I can tell, one in Iraq that everything we're talking about in terms of the power and malign influence of Iran in the region, the stage was set for that by the U.S. policy, U.S. invasion of Iraq and policy in Iraq over the last 2 decades. And then the collapse overnight of the Afghan National Security Forces. I was in Afghanistan in 2012, and frankly, it wasn't that hard to see even in 2012. So the only people who couldn't see it were the generals who were talking about progress being around the corner. I mean, to most of us, I think it was pretty obvious that it was a house of cards, that the Afghan National Army was a paper army. And so having lived through that, having lost friends to that, the last thing I want to see is America dragged into another open-ended, impossible war in the Middle East, or anywhere for that matter. However, it seems to me that some people have taken as a lesson from the disasters of the war on terror that the U.S. response now should be to kind of unmake itself and undress itself in front of the world and appear powerless. And they might not put it in those terms, but I sort of see that logic seeping through in the statements that some people are making, and that it's better to appear weak than it is to get drawn into another war. But I think that that's a false choice. And I also think that, exhibiting this level of weakness and senility, frankly, and infirmness is far from securing our peace, makes things more dangerous, increases the chances that we get dragged into another war. So there are certainly lessons to be drawn from the absolute failure of the war on terror, but broadcasting weakness and infirmness is not one of them, in my opinion. And so I'm sorry to take the last word here. I see we're at
No,
9,
I just want to
10.
say one thing. Our borders are open. Since Joe Biden has become president, our borders have been open. How weak do people want us to appear? It doesn't get any weaker than that, right? And who are the people who are coming across? We have no idea. No idea. So again, I don't think anyone here is saying that America needs to redeploy in the Middle East and do this and do that. But the idea of appearing weak, I mean, we're talking about American lives here, right? So I'm sorry, I just had to jump at that one. Like, it's not bad to appear weak. It's like maybe 10 million people have crossed our border illegally. I mean, what else are we supposed to do to appear weak? I mean, it's pretty far out there.
Yeah, and with a wide open southern border, we don't know who's come across. I mean, of that 10 million, we'd be incredibly lucky if at least some percentage of them don't intend to do us harm in some way, shape, or form. And again, I mean, like when you're that weak, you are inviting an attack, and so very dangerous times. We could easily get sucked back in. I think there could be a terrorist attack here in America because of our wide open southern border, and then we have an overreaction and we get deeply involved. And of course, we have the military industrial complex, and all the generals that fought the GWAT are now working on Raytheon and Lockheed. And they might not know great power competition, but these guys can sure sell a package about counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. And so, like that, the Pentagon's ready to sell that like right now because that's the old go-to. So it's just incredibly dangerous times because of the position that Biden's put us in.
Well, on that note, Joe, thank you very much. I really strongly recommend anybody who has not checked Joe's foreign policy stuff out, go to his Twitter, is where I have seen a lot of it, and just really consistently incisive and just spot on assessments of where U.S. interests lie and how we can promote those interests without falling down traps. And of course, Reed Lee Smith at Tablet. And thank you both for doing this. Thanks to our listeners. And you can look for the upload on YouTube sometime this week.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Joe.
Hey,
Thanks,
Joe,
Jake.
very grateful for that. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you.